My name is Paul Wolf. I'm from the Board of Housing Nantucket, and I'm here to welcome you and thank you and introduce the program. You're going to get a document tonight or have access to a document which initially was called a survey. And when I first heard about it, I said, oh no, not another survey. Someone's going to ask us what we already know and then tell us what we already know. This is more than that. This is a document to document and back up a number of initiatives in the area of workforce housing, affordable housing, or housing in general. With that, I will introduce Ann Cuspa, the Executive Director of Housing Nantucket.
Hi, everybody. Really great to see so many people here. I just quickly wanted to say thank you to the Athenaeum for helping us host the event. Thank you to the Community Foundation for all of your support financially and otherwise. And here we are to educate ourselves. It's I think we've all acknowledged that housing is really an issue that we all need to address, and the first step is really being informed. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Judy Barrett.
Hi, Judy Barrett from RKG Associates. I've been privileged to work on this project with Ann and to meet a number of people along the way as I worked on the study, many of which I think I see in the room. So my goal is to try to acquaint you really at a summary level with what is in this document, which is what the report actually looks like. There's a lot of data in here. Your eyes can kind of glaze over really easily, so I'm going to try to kind of strike at what the high points would be. And when I finish, I'm more than happy to try to address any questions that you might have. So with that, I think I will just start this. So let me tell you kind of what the organization of the presentation is. I want to kind of jump into what the key findings are, which are really laid out at the beginning of the document, and then look at some demographic trends as we understand them based on the data that were available to us. Look also at the housing conditions on Nantucket, which are varied and kind of interesting. Focus in on what some of the housing problems are that we found, not only statistically, but through observation, driving around, talking to people, and so forth. And then lay out some ideas for you to consider as you go forward with trying to embark on addressing the housing problems that exist here. I want to start by just defining some terms. One of the things that happens to planners, unfortunately, is that we quickly fall into using acronyms, and I'm going to try really hard not to do that, but sometimes it's a little bit inescapable. But there are some terms I'm going to refer to kind of throughout this presentation, and maybe it will help everybody if I just say what I'm talking about. First of all, I think we need to kind of have a common understanding of what's workforce housing. And that term is used throughout the country in kind of different ways. It typically, as here, does relate to some income ranges. The idea is that people within certain income ranges probably are folks who are the target audience for workforce housing. But from a planning point of view, it really is about making sure that there is a reasonable supply of housing that is suitable and affordable near where people live, near where people work, without regard necessarily to income limits. The issue, of course, is that people who are within certain income limits tend to have a problem finding housing near where they work. But the very broad definition of workforce housing is housing for the workforce near where people work. So that's how I'm going to try to use the term as much as possible here, but there will be a point in this presentation where I start focusing in on incomes, and I think it's kind of inescapable. At RKG, I should back up a little bit and just tell you about me. I've gotten very old in the planning world. I'm 61 years old. I've been in the field for a little over 30 years, and I go back far enough to remember when the euphemism affordable housing was born, which was roughly the mid-1980s, when an organization that some of you may be familiar with called the Mass Housing Partnership was created. And the Massachusetts Housing Partnership was born in 1985 to try to encourage suburbs to do something about affordable housing need. Before we started talking about affordable housing with the Mass Housing Partnership, we all used the phrase low and moderate income housing. And people found that somewhat offensive and difficult, and it sort of had connotations that people didn't like. So we latched onto affordable housing. And more recently, in the last 5 to 8 years, affordable housing now has become the euphemism that people don't want to say. So we're always kind of looking for terms to try to describe what really is housing need based on what people can afford. That's really what we're talking about. So when I use the phrase price-appropriate housing, I'm trying to speak sort of big picture, broadly, about the relationship between incomes and housing costs, and what is appropriate for people within their income range, appropriate meaning something that's reasonably affordable. So I may try to avoid euphemisms like affordable housing and workforce housing and just talk about price-appropriate where possible. The concept of housing cost burden goes way, way, way back. There's a long history to this. It's fascinating to people like me. It probably would bore you to tears. But housing cost burden is basically this concept where a certain percentage of one's income being spent on housing is considered reasonable and affordable. And over that, people start to be stressed. They have to start making difficult choices between food and heat and housing costs and transportation and so forth. So the federal standard, which has been in place for almost 20 years now, is this idea that 30% of one's income is generally the standard for housing affordability. And for a homeowner, that means a mortgage payment, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And for a renter, it's monthly rent and basic utilities. So within that 30% budget, if you will, that constitutes affordable housing. And over 30% being spent on housing costs is considered housing cost burden. When you get up in the range of 50% of one's income being spent on housing, that is considered severe housing cost burden. HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, actually refers to that as a phenomenon called worst-case housing needs, which you do have here in Nantucket. The American Community Survey is a wonderful tool. I'm going to talk about that from time to time. You're probably all familiar with the decennial census every 10 years because we're directed to by the Constitution. We take a survey or a census of our population. In the late 1990s, due to the advent of advanced computer technology, the Census Bureau started to introduce a way to say, well, why do we have to wait every 10 years to get information about our communities when we probably can do this on a sampling basis every year? And that is how the American Community Survey, shorthand ACS, was born. There are issues with the ACS, but it is the best tool that we have for a systematic source of data about incomes, housing types, housing affordability, all the things that we used to have to wait every 10 years to get from the census. Well, we now can get that on an annual basis based on survey sampling that's done over a rolling 5-year period. So much of the information that's in the report is based on the ACS. We like to use the ACS as planners because it enables us, among other things, to make comparisons between communities, to be able to look at how a community relates to a county, I realize you're one and the same, versus a state versus other communities. We just rely heavily on the census for that purpose. I say that recognizing that some of the numbers in the report may seem a little alien to you. If you have, for example, a population count that's a little different that you use here from the Census Bureaus, I understand that may happen. It certainly happens in many communities. But we're going to use the census numbers because they are the only systematic source of population and demographic data available anywhere in the country. Lower moderate income is a term that has sort of a statutory meaning, certainly a meaning with the federal government. In the simplest possible way to explain it is to understand that you have a median income for an area, and 80% or below that median for a household of any size would be considered lower moderate income. And then middle income is a very nondescript term, and boy, does that vary from community to community, but it's generally 100 to 120% of median. I realize here you use the term up to 150% of median income, which is fine. I think in this climate that probably makes sense for a definition of middle income. But just so you know, low and moderate income has a very specific meaning both in federal law and state law, and middle income is this sort of thing that we call it whatever we want to call it. So. And then I just want to also sort of talk about the geography that is referenced in the report. Your community, like many communities, is divided up into a series of what's called census tracts. The Census Bureau divides up smaller geographies in an attempt to be able to make comparisons within communities or within counties, as the case may be. And so this map just kind of tells you, you have these different census tracts. In the report, when you see it, you will see a number of tables and charts that refer to census tract numbers. We have actually tried to kind of connect those numbers to areas of the island as you know them, because you have names for all the different parts of your island. I'm not going to try to recite all those up here, but there are two areas in particular on this map that you're going to hear about kind of on a recurring basis. And in census terminology, they are tracts 9502 and 9504, generally kind of mid-island, Surfside area, where a lot of the housing needs exist, both on an income and a housing quality basis here, which I don't think will surprise anybody. Okay. Key findings. Some of this is factoid stuff, some of it is observation. You have, according to the Bureau of the Census, about 11,600 housing units, and 64% of them currently are seasonal, meaning they are occupied on a seasonal basis. That is a very large number of seasonal housing units. It must be interesting. How many of you live in a neighborhood where you're year-round, but you're surrounded by a lot of seasonal homes? Anybody in here? Is it strange? Or did you just get used to it? I would find it kind of weird because I live on a street where I have neighbors, right? Since 2000, since Census 2000, your owner occupancy rate has dropped by about 640 units or 5.5%. But there are some longer-term trends that I think are probably more important to focus on. Your owner occupancy rate actually fluctuates here. If you go way back, it's up as a percentage of the whole a little bit, but it certainly has fluctuated from decennial census to decennial census. What I think is particularly important is the increase in seasonal units here. It's really dramatic. Over the past decade or so, you gained about 2,400 housing units, and 1,500 of them are seasonal. So seasonal housing is clearly driving the demand here for housing. And as seasonal housing demand has gone up, the availability of renter-occupied units has gone down. I don't think there's really any surprise about that, and I think most people are at least anecdotally aware of that, if not statistically aware of it. So there's this pressure on the market here from people who want to be here seasonally, and what you have left is a year-round population of owners and renters who are competing for an increasingly limited supply, because so much of the supply is being consumed, if you will, by the seasonal market. I will continue to say throughout that the main problem here is one of supply. I don't think that's a big surprise, but let me just assure you, you have a shortage of supply here. And until you deal with the shortage of supply, you are going to continue to have a problem with housing affordability, housing suitability, housing appropriateness. You have a supply problem here. It's fundamental, it's systemic in your market. The lack of affordable housing here is a barrier to a decent quality of life for people who work on the island, whether they have a year-round job or they're stringing together jobs throughout the year in order to be able to stay here. Both of those phenomena exist among the year-round population. It also is a problem trying to attract and secure qualified people for some types of specialized positions. Early on in this project, I spent a couple of days here just interviewing different employers and so forth. And I just heard this over and over again, that either we've lost employees who can't find housing, we've offered jobs to people who then can't come because they can't find housing they can afford. So there's a barrier here, an economic development barrier, a community service barrier, and frankly, just a matter of social fairness barrier as well. The year-round and seasonal rental supply is conspicuously limited at all bedroom size and market levels. My finding is that the greatest demand for year-round units here is 2 bedrooms. I heard a lot of talk about needing to increase the supply of 1-bedroom units or studios or things like that, and I'm sure that that need does exist. I won't question that. But I'll tell you what I know as a planner with a lot of time in my career spent in housing, that if you want to attract and keep people in your community over the long run, you need housing that will evolve with people's life cycle. And if people are going to stay, they think about things like family formation and having children and so forth. And so if you focus your entire rental housing development effort on very, very small units, you may solve one problem at the expense of another. So I would just encourage you, as you're thinking about the development or the creation of more rental housing, to recognize that the need exists at market levels and what I would call appropriateness or suitability levels for different types of households. 55% of your homeowners and 40% of your renters are housing cost burdened. Let me just stop and tell you that all of these statistics I'm throwing at you are about your year-round population. Well, we actually don't have a lot of information about your seasonal homeowners or seasonal residents here, except that they must be fairly affluent because the cost of seasonal housing is so high. But their census, their demographic information is reported where they live year-round, or where their principal residence is. So these kinds of statistics relate to people who are here, living here on a year-round basis, may in fact relate to people who are sitting in this room. 55% of your homeowners and 40% of your renters are housing cost burdened, meaning, to refresh your memory, they are spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs in order to be able to live here. Those are high statistics. Most of your unaffordably housed renters are working age people, especially young people. Your median home price, most recent year, $1.2 million. Median family income is $92,800. Home ownership here is prohibitive for about 90% of your households. What that means is, for someone trying to move here, the income level that is required in order to afford this keeps going up and up and up. So there's a demographic and a sort of social aspect of this that I think people need to think about if you actually want to have a community where a lot of different people with different backgrounds and different job skills and so forth can live. So just looking a little bit at your history, these few charts you're going to see that are statistical, you are red. Nantucket is red in these charts. And so if you kind of go back to the 30s and 40s, there was this sluggish period. You actually went through a decade where you lost some population. But then this phenomenon called the boom hit. And in the 1970s and the 1980s, your population growth rate really picked up. And clearly, as you can see, between 1990 and 2000, your population increased quite a bit. So, it's just important to recognize you're not a secret. You're, in fact, a very desirable place, and a lot of people would like to live here and would probably like to live here more than just in the summer. Your population projections, based on those which are available to us, indicate that you're going to continue to grow, in most cases, actually a bit ahead of other geographies with which you would typically be compared, meaning the Vineyard and Barnstable County, and certainly the state as a whole. The state of the whole is kind of this sort of sluggish growth trend. We've been in that way for a while. But the demographers who do population projections foresee continued population growth here. Now, to some of us, that's very important. People tend to focus on population. As a housing planner, I tend to focus more on households because it's households that drive demand for housing more than population. But population's a worthwhile surrogate to pay attention to for demand. Now, as this change takes place, as you continue to sort of grow population-wise, that's really not the story. The real story is what happens to the age composition of your people as you continue to grow. And I'm here to tell you that I'm not the only person who's 61. There's a whole bunch of us. I was born in 1953. I'm going to be 62 in a few months. There are a lot of us, and we're not dying off very fast. So what's going to happen as you continue to grow is that you are going to see, and this is, by the way, fairly consistent with national trends. So you're not really out of line here. It's just that when you have a small population, it's a little bit scary. You're going to start to see a continued drop in your working age, your sort of peak year working age population, and an increase in people who are older. That has implications. See the town manager sitting here. I can tell you this has big implications for municipal service delivery. It is going to continue to affect public safety and other operations as we have an aging population. But it also really has economic development implications. I think we all need to be thinking about who is going to work in our communities as an increasingly large percentage of our population ages and leaves the workforce. And how are we going to take care of both the older set as well as the younger children? And as you can see, the demographers for Massachusetts also anticipate that as you are gaining older people, you are also going to be gaining younger children. So we call that an age dependency ratio. Planners like to come up with ratios and indicators and cool things like that. You're really kind of working toward a situation where there's a borderline issue of unsustainability here, where the relationship, the size relationship between the dependent population, your kids and your older people, will dwarf the size of the labor force. You have a remarkable amount of diversity here. I was not prepared for that when I started this project. I think I kind of, came to Nantucket with a lot of the baggage that probably a lot of other people do about this community. And what was interesting to me is that for all the time I spent interviewing people and kind of walking around and talking to folks, including on a weekend, I kind of went through stores here and just talked to folks. I was not prepared for the diversity in your community until I walked into your schools. And it jumped off the page, literally. And it made me kind of really go back and look at the data here. And I'll tell you why this is important. I'll talk about this more a little bit later. But there are big changes coming in the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was a piece of the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1968. It was updated twice in the last 25 years. Major changes are coming soon in the regulations for the Federal Fair Housing Act, and I just think all communities need to really be paying attention to, do we provide adequate housing choices? Is it possible for people of color to be able to choose where they're going to live? And what I found here, no surprise I think to any of you, is those two census tracts which are circled are the same ones that I had pointed out on the map earlier with focus areas, that you have island-wide, a fair amount of diversity, but it actually tends to be concentrated primarily into census tracts. And I think you're going to want to think about that as you explore options for increasing your supply. There's a tension here between wanting to make sure that people live near goods and services, and that's sort of good for sustainability, but at the same time, you also want to make sure that people are not forced to live in a certain area because they don't have any choices anywhere else in your community. And diversity is, people tend to sort of talk about race and ethnicity, which is fine, but I think one of the really fascinating statistics about your community is the foreign-born population. And to some extent, the foreign-born population tends to kind of dovetail with race and ethnicity. I wanted to just sort of point these arrows up here, kind of comparing you to the state. Massachusetts has 15% foreign-born population, you're 16%, that's pretty typical. But those who are not naturalized citizens in Massachusetts, it's about 50%, and you're almost 60%. And then when you look at, well, where are most of your foreign-born people coming from? They're coming from Latin America, and there's a really dramatic difference here. So you have a population here of foreign-born folks who are coming from particular areas. And that has implications in the schools for language, just for education. It has a lot of interesting issues. It also has, I think, some very important implications for economic development. And I just sort of want to point out that, again, in those same two census tracts that I put the arrows on early on the map, is where you have a very large, I would say, disproportionate concentration of the foreign-born population. So I'm looking at foreign-born, I'm looking at race, I'm looking at ethnicity, and then I'm looking at housing conditions, and I'm saying, I think there's a problem here. You think? Employment. We always try to look at kind of what's the employment base in any housing study, just to sort of understand what are the realistic opportunities for people to work. And according to a different source, not the census, actually it's the State Department of Labor and Workforce Development collects these statistics. You have like about 920 employers. Of course, these numbers fluctuate over the year. If you looked at these numbers in the summer, they're a little different from January. I'm giving you annual averages. About 920 employers, that includes public and private sector, and within the private sector, it's both for-profit and nonprofit. And a total of about 3,900 jobs. That's really not, that's sort of interesting, but it's not the whole story, because really what you also have here is a tremendous amount of self-employment. You have one of the largest percentages of self-employment that I've seen anywhere, except, interestingly, Barnstable County and South Berkshire County, which are also seasonal and resort areas. But there is a lot of self-employment here, and we tend to find that in environments like this, where the job base itself is not enough to support the population. People are stringing together just different ways to try to get by. So here's kind of the interesting finding about your jobs base. If you look at the employment base, in other words, the number of jobs that employers are providing, separate from self-employment. The strongest industries here are the construction trades. I don't think that's any surprise. Transportation services, real estate, a variety of support services, arts and recreation, and accommodation and food services. Those are the strongest industries here in terms of the percentage of the employment base that's occupied by those types of employers. Your highest wage employment is in construction trades, so that relates well. But then it's information and finance and insurance. Real estate's also high, but professional services, healthcare, and public administration. So there's a bit of a disconnect here between what types of industries are providing high wage employment and which industries are providing the most jobs. And that becomes an issue to a housing planner because you're trying to think about, well, what can people actually afford based on what the wage levels here? And the wage levels here don't really keep pace with the cost of housing, which is why I think it's not going to be any surprise to anybody. You have overoccupied housing here because people are trying to share housing because they can't afford housing on their own, and why people need help from organizations like your Interfaith Council because the incomes don't keep up with the housing costs. Why? Because the supply is too constrained. There are about 4,200 households here. I'm going to be rounding numbers here. 60% are families. Let me just explain to you in census terminology. A family is a household of 2 or more people related by blood, marriage, or adoption. Household is anything other than that and could be a single person living alone. So, you know, one of the things that's interesting about the households in Nantucket is that you are more likely to have, whether it's a family or a non-family, people with non-relatives living in their home. This is sort of a census window into what I think many of you are probably aware of, which is the kind of house sharing or the over-occupancy problem that exists in some parts of the island. Non-family households in Nantucket are less likely to be single people living alone than the rest of the state or the national trends or even Barnstable County. Your renter households are larger than the state average, and what I need to point out to you is that when the Census Bureau counts how many people are in a household, they're looking at the whole housing unit and they're counting all the people who are in it. That includes the non-relatives. So that tends to skew your average household size for renters because you have both families and then you have non-relatives occupying units together. And so that tends to drive this sort of larger number of, or larger average number of people in a renter household. Just to be aware of that. Your household incomes, I won't try to break all this down for you, but I think you can kind of tell intuitively. The red at the bottom is the lowest income range. The green at the top is the higher income range. How's that for using colors to denote what most people could probably figure out? What's significant about these bars, this is just taking, here's the households in each census tract in your town, and of course the town as a whole, which is on the far left. And looking at, well, okay, what's the income mix as you move from census tract to census tract? And the thing to pay attention to is where does the green start? Because where the green starts, if it's like halfway down the bar, that tells you that half or more of the households in that census tract have incomes of at least $100,000 or more. And where the green starts higher up, it's because you've got more households with lower incomes. So if you look at Census Tract 9502, which is the third set of bars in, it's Nantucket 9501, 9502, you can see that the green starts pretty high up. And that's because that particular tract, which is one of the ones I had arrows on back on the map, has a lot of households that don't have a lot of money. 9504, which is the other one, that's the first one in from the right. You're right. You know, it's relatively the same. You know, you've got a situation here where in different parts of the island, you have a very different income mix. So I'm now looking at concentrations of race, ethnicity, foreign-born, and income. From a housing policy perspective, that raises a lot of questions. Total housing, I mentioned this earlier in my findings, about 11,600 units, including both year-round and seasonal. Your housing mix here is predominantly detached single-family homes. That's both an asset. If you own a single-family home here, that's probably an asset to you because they're worth a lot of money. if you're trying to address housing needs, a housing mix that's made up of predominantly single-family homes can be a real problem, because single-family homes don't use land very efficiently. So just to be aware that that's both an asset and a potential liability. In those mid-island neighborhoods I referred to, about 80% of all the renters on this island, year-round renters, live there. So now I have concentrations of renters, race, ethnicity, foreign-born, and income. The same neighborhoods, as I said, house a majority of your Black and Hispanic residents. Won't try to recite all these numbers for you that are in the report, but this is basically just a comparison of kind of, what are the sort of income, what's the sort of median income for a household of different sizes, what types of units tend to be suitable for that household size, and then what's the sort of maximum income for at different types of housing assistance is one available for. And I think you can see that at the 60% AMI column, if you look at maximum affordable housing costs, there are 3 columns there. If you focus just on the 60% AMI, I think you can see that as the households get bigger, of course, the amount that can be afforded goes up, but it is really pales in significance to what is actually being charged here for people to live in a market rate unit. So it's really no wonder that you have people doubling up or tripling up or whatever, just sharing housing, because what one can afford is very hard to find here. And also on the the farthest column closest to me, I've just put in what the HUD fair market rent is. I just want to make sure people know what that means. People think people sometimes don't understand. Under the program called Section 8, in which housing authorities and others can provide assistance to renters who are lower moderate income, HUD has a standard for a maximum rent, so that you're not using federal funds to pay for luxury housing. So the fair market rent for a single person, a one-person, studio unit might be $935. That would be hard to find here. To find a standard unit, one that actually meets housing quality standards, for $935 a month is difficult. And I say that not only because I've looked at the data, but also because I've been following with great interest the Facebook page where people are looking for housing, and some of those stories are pretty dramatic. Sometimes people ask me, well, so we have half our households paying more than 30% of their income for housing. Don't people choose sometimes to just pay a lot because they want to live in Nantucket or wherever? And the answer is sure, to some extent. I mean, if you have a lot of money and you're paying 35% of your income for rent or mortgage payment, it's not going to have the same impact on you as if you're lower income. So to help us address these problems or these statistical issues that are not easy to discern from the census, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development does a special tabulation. It's called a user-defined data set, and it's called the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy Data, which have been around since about 1990. And what HUD does with the Census Bureau is basically cross-tabulate households by number of people in the household by income. So now you can get a picture of small to large households. What are people paying for housing? Do they have housing problems in addition to cost? And how does that distribute in the community? So looking in at how that breaks down. According to HUD's special tabulation series, 70% of your homeowners with incomes between 50 and 80% of AMI. In other words, that's below the median. We're not talking $92,000 here. We're talking lower than that. And 68% of the homeowners that are in that sort of close to middle income group are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. So now you can get a picture of, in income groups, how does this problem housing cost burden affect people? And it's significant. Your asking rents, again, the red is sort of the problem, right? So I've kind of flipped this around. The red is high rents. Asking rents here, the Census Bureau doesn't distinguish between seasonal or year-round in terms of rents. They're just saying, here's what was on the market at a given time, and here's what the rents were. They're high. And the real issue that this chart doesn't tell you, this chart tells you that you don't have much affordable housing relative to what people can pay. But what it doesn't really capture, that the rest of my presentation will get into, is the problem is supply. It's not just that the rents are high, it's that there are very few units available. So people are scrambling for the same limited supply of housing here, whether they are a year-round worker with a professional position for the town or the hospital, or some other organization, or someone who's changing sheets in the hotel. Everybody's competing for the same limited stock. That's the problem. Key issues in your rental inventory is, first and foremost, the lack of supply. Second, no surprise to anybody in this room, there are code violations which are not being addressed. I know why they're not being addressed. I get it. Once you go out and you do code enforcement, where do you put people? So it's a fundamental policy problem for any community that has a lot of substandard housing. And substandard can mean it's basically an okay condition, but it's overoccupied. In this case, I think you have both code violation problems as well as overoccupied units. And that picture is just kind of an example of when you drive down certain streets in this community, the front yards, the side yards are just full of cars. And it's not because the people who live there are bad people. It's because they need to share housing in order to have something they can afford. Looking strictly at your year-round households, according to HUD, about 38% of your households fall into that category of lower moderate income. Sometimes people find that shocking because Nantucket is perceived as kind of a wealthy community. But you know, there's a lot of need here. There may actually be a lot of need in this room, but people don't stand up and say, I need housing. They just don't do it. But 38% actually is not, it really isn't a surprise to me. I'm kind of used to seeing that kind of number. So HUD estimates that about 38% of your homeowners and 49% of your renters have incomes at or below 80% of median. I find that it's fairly common in the seasonal and resort towns that I've worked in. Your highest housing cost burden is your lowest wage earners, those sort of young working age people with incomes at or below 50% of AMI. That's where the highest incidence of housing cost burden is. You don't have an adequate supply of affordably priced rentals for what I would call, whether it's politically correct or not, the working poor. And they are here. People whose incomes are at or below that 60% threshold for workforce housing programs, there's a critical need here for housing that is suitable and affordable for those populations. They may not be a department head. I'll pick on you, Andrew. I guess I can see you. There may not be a department head for the town, but you know, when you go and you buy coffee in the morning at a coffee shop, somebody's serving you coffee. Somebody's waiting on you when you go into a restaurant. Somebody's in the hotels, as I said earlier, changing sheets or cleaning up. I mean, those people on whom your economy depends are in this income group, and you don't have housing for them. Chapter 40B has, I think, an undeservedly bad name in a lot of communities. I won't stand here and advocate for Chapter 40B, but you know, your inventory right now is about 121 units, which is 2.5% of your year-round housing stock. You haven't gained much in the realm of Chapter 40B units. And what's interesting to me is that you may be actually at risk of losing some unless somebody's actually doing something to preserve what's on the inventory. You have units that are slated to expire this year. Affordable housing is protected to be affordable over time with some type of deed restriction. And many of the older developments, the deed restrictions are what we call expiring use. So eventually they're term limited. So you have 2 developments on your subsidized housing inventory where the units are going to expire, the use restrictions will expire, and you won't be at 121 units or 2.5%, you'll be at something significantly less. And so my question for you as a community is, what's the plan? And if there is a plan, that's great, but I don't know what it is. I hope you do. Now, that said, you know, a lot has been done here, and to your credit as a community, you know, I was really kind of impressed to see some of what's gone on, because I've worked in other resort communities where I can't stand up here and I can't stand up and say some of the things that you have done. First of all, you have Housing Nantucket, which has 24 rental units and 56 covenant homes under a really interesting program that you created in the early 2000s through a special act of the legislature, the Covenant Needs Program. So that's wonderful. And then you have a relationship with Habitat for Humanity, which has done 6 homeownership units here, and 1, as I understand it, currently under construction. The Housing Authority has entered into an agreement with Housing Assistance Corp of Cape Cod to do Sachem's Path, 36 units under construction. Eventually, that will generate 8 more units on the subsidized housing inventory. So, that kind of land lease or land conveyance of surplus land for housing is great. The town has units. This is, I think, particularly unusual. I don't usually see this even in resort communities, but the town has a unit at Westchester Street. There are 4 units for DPW workers. The airport has a dwelling unit with 6 to 8 beds. I think folks probably all know all of this. There's seasonal housing for, under the aegis of the police department, for summer reserve officers and lifeguards. Some of your employers do employer-assisted housing, mainly in the realm of kind of dormitory-type units, but not all of it. The Coast Guard has housing here. And then you have your Interfaith Council, which has a wonderful rental assistance program to help people on kind of a stopgap basis. So there's stuff happening here, which is good, and I want to just commend you for that, because I don't want to stand here and say you're not doing anything, but you're not doing enough. You're not doing enough. Short of significantly increasing the supply, you will not be able to address the needs of any of the groups that need housing that's appropriate in their income range, including but not limited to people in the workforce. The existing supply is just plainly and across the board inadequate. I'm not just saying this, past housing studies have said this. I was kind of shocked when I started reading the old housing studies here. When I started, I thought, why do you guys need me, right? You already know all this, right? I think you need me because I'm the old mom who's going to come in and say, you haven't done enough. But I mean, this is known here. This is known here. The supply has been inadequate for a long time. So we just sort of laid out some ideas in the report. I thought that the last housing study that was done here had a lot of really good information in it, but it seemed a little bit ambitious in terms of how much you could produce. So I said, all right, if you've actually created 2,400 units in the last decade, certainly you can focus in the next 10 years on trying to create 240 units that are affordably priced at different levels. That can't be that difficult. And so I've just said there are ways you can do this. And I want to just start by telling you there's nothing in this list that's going to be the silver bullet. It isn't going to be just Chapter 40B. It isn't going to be just rental housing on town-owned land. It isn't just going to be some zoning tweaks that you might consider doing. You need to look at a multiplicity of tools. I need to tell you as a planner, I do a lot of master plans. I just do a lot of planning work around Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut. There is nothing harder in planning than affordable housing. There is nothing harder. It is so difficult. Because people will come to meetings like this and they'll say, well, we know we need more housing and we really support it, but then when it comes to the specific proposal on the ground, that's when the trouble starts. So some ideas for you to consider. First of all, I would make better use of Chapter 40B. It's May. I'm living my life right now between the middle of April and the end of this month at town meetings. I just go from one town meeting to the next, night after night after night, because it's town meeting season. It is so hard to change zoning at a town meeting. Kudos to you for the zoning changes you got through. It's really, really difficult to do. And so, just be aware that if you can't get harmony around some zoning that's actually going to create the density you need to increase your supply, think about ways to make better use of Chapter 40B. We have some interesting examples in Massachusetts of communities that actually reached out to the development world and said, have you got land? Because if you have land, come talk to us. We're looking for a particular type of development, and we'll work with you as a comprehensive permit developer if you can help us address the following needs. That is kind of a well-tested sort of method out there. Certainly constructing rental housing on town land, I know that's under discussion here. That is certainly appropriate to do. One of the most striking things that hit me when I started this job was arriving at Ann's building and seeing all these houses out back on cement blocks. I mean, there are houses out there that are bigger than my house. I have 9 children. I raised my children in a house that's smaller than some of the houses that are on your property. And I thought, well, why are these here? And what I've kind of come to understand is that you do allow 2 structures on a lot here, but there's no way to kind of put a house on a lot that doesn't conform. And that is out there in Massachusetts as a way to think about creating some affordability. If you have a lot that doesn't conform, well, yeah, you can't just build any house on it, but you might be able to put a relocation unit there and make it an affordable house. So just something to think about is can you make use of some of the small lots that you have for an affordable housing unit, either a single family or a two-family dwelling. Inclusionary zoning, I work on this nationally. I have to tell you, it's not the be-all and end-all. Inclusionary zoning is this concept where if you say to the developer, if you're going to build more than a certain number of units, or if you're going to do a certain amount of commercial space, you have to give us affordable units. And I know you have something sort of like that here, I think, in your commercial projects, right? I think there's some ways that you could look at using inclusionary zoning here. It's just that this is such a warped market. And I mean that kindly. It's just the extremes here, I think, make inclusion kind of difficult. But if you're going to zone for multifamily or any kind of higher density, I would encourage you to think about ways to perhaps, to exact from the developers, if you will, some percentage of affordable units, and think about tiering them so that you meet different market levels. Or make them all at 150% of median if that's really your primary target, but then use Community Preservation Act money or other kinds of sources that might be available to buy down some of those units to a lower income range. And then, just be conscious of this tension around you want to have housing close to goods and services, and I think that's really where you need to kind of increase your supply. Be open to the idea that not everything has to have an affordable housing restriction. Clearly you want to provide affordable housing, but you need to get the supply up. There's just no getting around it. What resources? A housing bank. As some communities have done, a housing bank can be a couple of different things. It can be a land trust that owns land and allows ground leases of property to build housing. There are some communities that have adopted the housing trust legislation, which I think you have here, where the trust literally can loan money to a developer. So if the trust is managing your Community Preservation Act funds for affordable housing, the trust can basically be a bank and can make decisions about the types of projects that it wants to invest in and become a sort of a source of gap financing. Issuing bonds for land acquisition for housing affordability. Having a very strong housing trust, and I can't underscore this enough. A housing trust, in order to be effective, really has to be independent. And so the extent to which you can have a housing trust that controls whatever you appropriate from the Community Preservation Act and other sources for housing, and is independently able to make some decisions about where and how they're going to invest that money. So there's a real management plan for the fund is just very key. Forming working relationships with experienced nonprofits. We have some nonprofit developers from Boston who kind of discovered about 10 years ago that federal funds are drying up. And so they've kind of embarked now on trying to go out into the suburbs and work with communities that want to create affordable housing. Those nonprofits are out there for the asking. And so kind of making some relationships with those folks and building up capacity here to actually do housing development, I think, would be very important. Certainly also for rental housing, you need to make sure you've got adequate management capacity. I mentioned earlier about the Federal Fair Housing Act, and I just really want to underscore this without scaring everybody to death. But the Federal Fair Housing Act is what's called cross-cutting legislation. Any federal money you get, whether it's for transportation, for libraries, for schools, whatever, Federal Fair Housing Act cross-cuts those sources. New regulations are coming under the Federal Fair Housing Act that are really going to challenge communities to look at their zoning and other types of policies and determine whether, not intentionally, but is the effect of local policy encouraging the concentration of people by race, by ethnicity, by language, whatever. So be thinking about this as you embark on ways to increase your housing supply, that geographic choice is very important. And to kind of always be thinking about, well, what do you actually mean by workforce housing? The 60 to 150% standard you have here makes eminent sense to me from an income point of view, but I just have to drive home the point, again, probably sick of hearing me say it. People who are under those income limits who work on this island today do not have housing they can afford. And your economy, based on the number of jobs here, is dependent on that population. And then considering tax incentives or other types of methods like that to encourage affordable housing. Some communities are doing that now. There are actually a couple of town meeting votes out there in Massachusetts this season looking at going to the legislature for permission to provide specific tax relief for people who will rent to lower moderate income households or develop housing for lower moderate income people. And then as you increase your supply, especially given the zoning incentives that were passed at town meeting this year, I think you really have to start focusing on code enforcement. And I know you all know this, but there's just a question here of basic social fairness and decency, that people need a place to live and you don't want to kick them out, but you also don't want them living in substandard housing. Bad things happen in substandard housing. There are fires. We just had one in Arlington in the last couple of days. I don't know if you heard, Andrew. I know you were up there. But bad things happen in substandard, code non-compliant housing. So increasing supply should give you a tool to start to crack down, frankly, on some of the code problems that you have here. I'm done. Do you have questions? I'm happy to. I'll talk for hours about this, but I don't want to drive you guys, put you all to sleep.
Okay, so we're going to open up the Q&A, and I would like to just ask that we let everybody speak once before speaking again if you feel the need. So let's see, I'll go to Dave.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thought you did a great job.
Thank you.
I think you brought up 40B, and I probably agree with the idea that it's probably one of the most underutilized potentials for the island. Could you kind of take us all through how that works compared to, say, a traditional subdivision of 10 lots?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll start by telling you, I actually do a lot of work in 40B. I'm a technical assistance consultant to boards of appeal for the Mass Housing Partnership. So I live, eat, sleep, and breathe 40B. And it's not perfect, but I will explain it to you. Chapter 40B essentially says that if your community does not have 10% of your year-round housing affordable to lower moderate income people, a developer who receives a state qualification letter can come to your Board of Appeals and apply for a comprehensive permit, which is it's basically a unified permit. It wraps into one all of the permits that are under local regulation. So if you require site plan review or a special permit, it's wrapped into the comprehensive permit. A Board of Health retains its authority under Title V, but if the Board of Health has local regulations in excess of Title V, that gets wrapped into the comprehensive permit. If you have a Conservation Commission and the property triggers a wetland review, the Conservation Commission retains its authority under the State Wetlands Act, but if you have a local wetlands bylaw and the developer or the applicant needs relief from that, that gets wrapped into the comprehensive permit. It's a way of saying one entity is going to grant all the local approvals required for an affordable housing development to go forward. In order for a developer to come to the Board of Appeals, they have to start by applying to a state housing subsidy agency for what we call a project eligibility letter. And that can take anywhere from 3 months to a year to get a letter from one of these agencies. But essentially, the developer has to show that the town is at or below 10%, that the site makes sense for affordable housing, that the project is feasible and is likely to be buildable if it's approved. Those are sort of the basic pieces of what the developer has to show to a housing subsidy agency. If the housing subsidy agency is satisfied, it issues what's called a project eligibility letter. In the old days, we called it site approval, and you may still hear that term. Once the developer has that letter and also has site control over the property and can demonstrate that the applicant is eligible, it's either a public housing authority or a nonprofit or a for-profit developer who agrees to limit profit. That applicant can go to the Board of Appeals, apply for a comprehensive permit, and the Board of Appeals is then the authority for the town granting that a permit. You're typically submitting what's called a preliminary plan. It's not terribly detailed. It should be more detailed, in my opinion. But the board has to work with the applicant to arrive at a permit that the board can grant and essentially provide enough direction to the building inspector that when the applicant comes back and says, I'm ready to build, the plans that are submitted at that point, which are detailed, can be deemed consistent with the plan the Board of Appeals approved, which is conceptual or preliminary. So that's kind of how the process works. The Board of Appeals has a limited timeline to act on these projects. You have to open the public hearing in 30 days. If anybody in here is on a planning board or Board of Appeals, you know that for a special permit, you've got 65 days to open the hearing and 90 days to file your decision. With a comprehensive permit, you open in 30 days and you file your decision within 40 days from the public hearing. And so that's, in many other respects, it's very much like any other proceeding. There's notice to the abutters. It's a public hearing process. The abutters have input. And the board basically has to make a determination whether the project meets the requirements of the statute and that the waivers the developer is requesting are necessary for that project to proceed. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Once the project is built and they're built at affordable levels, is there anything to keep them affordable?
The deed restriction, there is supposed to be a deed restriction on the affordable units that protects them. Today, it's in perpetuity. Today, it's in perpetuity. But some of the older restrictions were time limited. There's a whole issue around these deed restrictions. I should just tell you this isn't as easy as people might think. And I frankly think it's best for towns to go ahead and work with conventional comprehensive permits rather than what some people call kind of friendly, which is the town sort of controls the project eligibility process. Because if a housing subsidy agency is granting that project eligibility letter, they own all the responsibility for monitoring the deed restrictions. And so there's some advantages to working with the housing agencies. But there's a deed restriction, it gets recorded with the Registry of Deeds. If it's a rental project, the owner of the project is supposed to provide evidence to the subsidizing agency every year that the affordable rental units are occupied by people who are income eligible, paying a rent they can afford. If it's a home ownership development, the monitoring is limited to, are you continuing to occupy this as your principal residence? So you have to be income eligible the day you close a loan, but if you continue to improve your economic condition, you don't have to leave the affordable unit, but you do have to occupy it as a principal residence. In environments like this, that can get a little bit tricky. People, kind of discover that they can make some money if they rent their unit, and it always then creates some tension around who's going to enforce. That's why I'm saying that having the subsidizing agency be the enforcement rather than the town of Nantucket probably would make more people a little happy. I'm not sure the town actually wants to go and kick somebody out of their house, but there is an enforcement mechanism.
Judy, hi, Andrew Vorse, as you know. Thanks for the excellent work, and I just want to say the Nantucket Planning and Economic Development Commission, which shared in the funding of this, is really happy to see this study updated, so thank you.
Thank you.
One question I wanted to ask you is that the 40R provision,
Yep.
is it still used, and is there still funding provided by the state?
Thank you. I almost put 40R in this report, and I thought, I can't imagine Nantucket kind of wanting this density, but Chapter 40R was passed about 10 years ago as a way for the state to say to communities, okay, you don't like 40B, we get it, then here's a tool you can use. And essentially what it allows a community to do is to create a district, which is an overlay. What it means is that the existing zoning is not disturbed, but there are additional opportunities for development in the overlay district. And if a community creates a Chapter 40R district, overlay district, that meets the requirements of the statute, you're eligible for what's called a zoning incentive payment. In other words, the town gets a check for passing the zoning. And then for each unit that's built in the 40R overlay district, which could not have been built otherwise, you get what's called a bonus payment for each building permit. I am told there is money still in that fund. There's always issues of, is the 40R fund exhausted? My understanding is that there is money there. And that has continued to be replenished. And the other aspect of 40R that communities kind of find interesting is that if you end up with school costs in excess of the revenue generated by the development, there's an additional Chapter 70 allocation that comes to your community to offset the cost of education for the children. But it's still out there. And the beauty of 40R, by the way, is that you can require design review, which, as you know, under the State Zoning Act is a little bit precarious, but you can require design review in a Chapter 40R development and have all of your design guidelines and so forth written into the regulations. It's a good tool.
Thanks. With our obsession of conservation land, and you talk about partnerships with land banks, can you just tell me a little bit about people you've seen in the past have turned kind of their focus on conservation towards conservation-minded affordable housing? Because we seem to have that in excess. So how do we kind of, can you give us an example? Someone who's
Yes,
done
Lincoln,
that?
Massachusetts is probably one of the most renowned examples of any community in the country that has managed to work open space and housing together. The state's poster child for years of mixed income development is a project called Battle Road Farm, which is in Lincoln. And it was actually built on a piece of land the town acquired. And part of it is open space, part of it's a commercial project, part of it is affordable housing. Lincoln has done a lot to marry the interests of conservation and housing. Falmouth was one of the first towns in the state to try a land trust model, which was the, having retaining ownership of the land and doing a ground lease for housing development. And a chunk of that site was to be held in open space. There are lots of open space affordable housing partnerships in the United States. I mean, almost just too numerous to name, because so many communities, not just yours, have had this tension between wanting to preserve, understandably, and then having to deal with the consequences of buying a lot of land, which is you restrict the land supply and you drive up the cost of housing. Yeah.
So I guess to be more specific, how, not I guess a town, but just an example of a partnership that works, like from a planning perspective, like what is the relationship of ownership to, if you're, telling someone how to run the most, like so Lincoln, right? So how did they set that up? How did it work? Or is that too?
Almost socialism. It's a great story. Really, it's the People's Republic of Lincoln, and I did their master plan, so I love that town. I'm not speaking pejoratively of them, but, Lincoln kind of learned a long time ago that there's only so much you can do with zoning. And if you really want to control the fate of land, you have to own it, which certainly anybody who's been involved with open space understands this. If you really want to protect land, you buy it. Right? So Lincoln was already in a mode of buying land. And because the town's, I think ideologically, is just a very liberal community, way back when you had this interesting town full of people with old family estates on one hand and a lot of academics on the other, trying to figure out how we're all going to get along. They started kind of experimenting with, okay, we're buying all this land, how can we actually meet community needs? And I don't know if anybody in here has ever been in Lincoln, but their little town center where their shopping area is, they have a little grocery store and some gift shops, and that is all on land that was actually acquired by this entity called the Rural Land Foundation. They inherited some of it, they bought some of it, they set some of it aside for open space, most of it. They set some of it aside for a village center, which did not exist and now does, and then some of it for one of the state's earliest housing co-ops, which has since converted to a rental development. But they just had people kind of recognizing on the Rural Land Foundation that imbalance is not a good thing. And if you want your kids to be able to live in your community, or if you want people to have choices to downsize without having to leave, you can be as proactive about housing as you are about open space. And that's what they did. But I think it really was sort of an ideological impetus underneath this. But it's out there. I think that it really starts with a conversation with the open space, the conservation interests, because they know how to get land. They are really good at it. And, and they also have, I think, a sense of purpose, too, and trying to work with people around, do you understand that when there's an imbalance, there's a problem here? You can buy up all this land, but if you don't have housing for the people on whom your economy depends, at some point, owning all that land doesn't do much. I mean, it might have tremendous environmental merit, but what kind of community are you trying to create? I think that's what the conversation has to be, is what kind of community are we trying to create here, and for whom? Welcome.
Any other questions? Seeing none. I just want to say it's been a pleasure to work with you. I thank you so much for this great presentation. Just a couple things. Andrew, I'm so sorry. Thank you to the NP and EDC. You've been really great to us too, so, as well as the Community Foundation. There's a lot of people in the room who participated in getting Judy's data, So thank you all for that. Let's see, there's a couple things. Oh, the full report is on our website, housingnantucket.org. There's an executive summary as well because it's over 60 pages. We will have Judy's presentation on our website. Channel 18 is here. Thank you for that. And we'll be airing this on demand shortly. Let's see, and then sign-in sheet. Hopefully anybody who is interested in learning more has signed on, and if not, it's around here somewhere. And finally, we are forming a work group. This is just the beginning. So our work group is forming. Our timeline, the first deliverable, will be when the town meeting warrant opens, and that is, their citizens articles will be this fall, and selectmen will have their opportunity to do things until, I believe it's January. So thank you all for attending. We've got some snacks and mingling, and if Judy will be here for about, I don't know, 45 minutes or so, but then we'll be closing the doors. And thanks again to the Athenaeum, too.
Thank you very much.